Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Creaks. The Pacific Northwest is home to some of the densest, most isolated wilderness in the world. It's a place where people go to get lost, and sometimes they're never found. Tonight, we have 5 terrifying true horror stories from the deep woods, from a search and rescue discovery that defies explanation to an FBI training exercise that turned into a fight for survival. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now turn off the lights and let's head into the trees. They call it tree well suffocation. You fall headfirst into the snow around a tree. You can't get out, you freeze. It's a tragic accident. At least that's what the coroner writes down when he doesn't want to explain the bite marks. This happened on New Year's Eve 3 years ago in the Sawtooth Wilderness in Idaho. I'm a search and rescue volunteer. I've been for almost 12 years now. My name is Ben, and I've seen my share of bad outcomes in the backcountry, but nothing prepared me for what we found that night. I still think about it constantly. The official story doesn't match what I saw out there, and that gap between truth and record keeps me up at night. The call came in around 2 p.m. A tourist named Greg Hutchins hadn't returned from a solo snowshoe trip. He was supposed to be back by noon, and his wife was frantic. She said he'd left their rental cabin at 7 a.m., planning to do a short loop, maybe 3 hours total. He had a radio emergency beacon, the whole setup, but he never came back. The conditions were brutal that day. It was negative 10 degrees, and the snow was 6 feet deep in places. A whiteout warning had been issued for the evening, which meant we had maybe 3 hours of viable search time before visibility went to 0. Our team leader Dale assembled 6 of us at the trailhead. We had 2 avalanche dogs, Atlas and Juno, along with all the standard gear. Probes, radios, medical kits, the works. I remember noting right away that the dogs were off. Atlas is my dog, a Belgian Malinois that lives for this work. Normally he's pulling at the lead, whining with excitement, practically vibrating with energy. That day his tail was tucked and his hackles were up. Juno, the other dog, was doing the same thing. Both handlers noticed it. Dale noticed it too, but we didn't have time to debate animal behavior. A man was missing and the clock was ticking. Every minute that passed in those temperatures reduced Greg's chances of survival. We split into 2 teams, went with Dale and another volunteer named Corey along with Atlas. The other team took Juno and headed east. We headed north toward the area where Greg's car had been parked. The snow was deep, and even with snowshoes, every step took effort. The forest was dense. Thick stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, and the silence was oppressive. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of our snowshoes and our breathing. I'm used to quiet in the wilderness, but this felt different. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. About 40 minutes in, we found Greg's tracks. They were fresh, probably from that morning. Atlas picked up the scent immediately, but he was still acting strange. He'd move forward, stop, look back at me, then move again. His body language was all wrong. The tracks themselves told a troubling story. They were erratic, sometimes weaving between trees, sometimes heading in straight, desperate lines. Whoever made them was running. You can tell when someone's running in. Snowshoes. The prints dig deeper at the toe, the spacing gets irregular. These prints screamed panic. That's when Dale spotted the second set of tracks. They were behind Greg's, following the same path but spaced differently. These were snowshoe prints too, but old-fashioned wooden ones. You could tell from the shape and the impression pattern, the kind you'd see in a museum or hanging on the wall of some mountain lodge. What made them strange was the stride length. Dale pulled out a measuring tape and we checked. 7.5 feet between steps. I looked at Corey and he looked back at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. A normal walking stride for a man is maybe 2.5 to 3 feet. Even running, you'd be hard-pressed to hit 7 feet consistently. And these prints were deep, pressed firmly into the snow. Not the shallow, quick impacts of a sprint. Dale radioed the other team to report what we'd found. His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge in it. We kept following the tracks. The whole time, Atlas was getting more and more agitated. His ears were pinned back, and he kept looking off into the trees to our left. I trusted that dog more than most people. If he was scared, there was a reason. I've seen him work in avalanche debris in whiteout conditions around wildlife. Nothing rattles him. But that day something had him spooked. We'd been walking for maybe another 20 minutes when I heard it. A whistle. 3 short blasts. That's a standard SR signal, the sound we use to call attention or signal location. But something about it was wrong. The rhythm was too perfect, too mechanical. Tweet, 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 pause, tweet, tweet, tweet. It repeated exactly the same way each time, like a recording on a loop. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. Just the whistle again from somewhere deeper in the trees. Dale tried his radio, calling for the other team to confirm their position. They were a mile east. It wasn't them. Dale decided we should keep moving forward on Greg's trail. The whistle continued for a few more minutes, then stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse. My heart was pounding and I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or fear. We came to a clearing maybe 30 yards across, ringed by a tight cluster of lodgepole pines. The trees were massive, old growth, their bases thick and gnarled. Atlas refused to enter. He planted his feet and wouldn't budge no matter how much I encouraged him. I tried treats, commands, everything. He just stared at the clearing and whined. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Dale told me to try probing the area with my avalanche pole. I moved into the clearing and approached the nearest tree. The snow around the base was disturbed, but not in a natural way. It looked like it had been packed down, then refluffed to appear untouched. Someone had tried to hide their work. I extended my probe pole and pushed it down into the snow near the trunk. And once about 4 feet, it hit something. Not rock or frozen ground. Something soft but frozen. Something that gave slightly under pressure, like pressing into cold meat. I looked at Dale. He nodded. I started digging. Corey came over to help. We used our hands and small shovels, working as fast as we could. The snow was light and powdery on top, but packed solid underneath. What we found wasn't Greg. It was a woman. She was frozen solid, suspended vertically inside the tree well, her body wedged into the hollow space around the trunk. She was wearing a bright orange ski suit, the kind you'd see in photos from the 80s. Neon stripes, puffy sleeves, completely out of date. Her face was turned upward, eyes closed, skin waxy and pale like a mannequin. Around her torso was wire mesh, the kind used for fencing, wrapped tight to keep her in place, to keep scavengers out. The worst part was her leg. Her left thigh had a clean surgical cut, a section of flesh removed with precision. The edges were too neat, too deliberate. This wasn't scavenger damage. This wasn't an animal. Someone had carved her. Someone had butchered her with a knife or scalpel. My stomach dropped. I felt bile rise in my throat. I turned away and dry heaved into the snow. Dale immediately got on the radio calling for law enforcement and the rest of the team. Corey was staring at the body, his face pale. I forced myself to look around the clearing. There were 6 trees in this cluster. 6 trees, all with disturbed snow at their bases, all positioned in a rough circle. I walked to the next tree and probed. 4 feet down, I hit something again. I didn't dig this time. I just moved to the next tree, same thing, and the next, and the next. This wasn't a burial site. This was a pantry. Someone was storing bodies here, keeping them frozen, preserving them. The realization hit me like a freight train. We'd stumbled into something that shouldn't exist. That's when I saw it. Across the clearing, maybe 40 yards out, standing perfectly still next to a large pine. A shape. At first I thought it was a tree or a snow-covered stump, but then it moved slightly. A subtle shift of weight. It looked like a person, but wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 feet or more. It was wearing something white, furs, or maybe a ghillie suit, blending almost perfectly with the snow and trees. Its arms hung down past its knees. Way too long for a normal person. I froze. I literally couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. Dale was still on the radio. Corey hadn't noticed yet. The thing raised one arm slowly. It was holding something, a rifle. I could see the barrel clearly, the dark metal stark against the white. My brain tried to process this. An animal doesn't carry a rifle. A person does. But the proportions were all wrong. The way it stood was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. I managed to choke out a single word. Dale. He looked up at me, then followed my gaze. The color drained from his face. Corey turned and saw it, too. For maybe 5 seconds, we all just stood there staring. Then Dale screamed for us to move. The thing didn't chase us. It just turned and walked into the trees with impossible speed. No sound, no crashing, just a smooth glide through the forest, like it was floating on top of the snow, like it weighed nothing. We ran. I'd like to say we were tactical and smart, but we just ran. Atlas was ahead of me, and I followed him blindly. My lungs burned from the cold. My heart felt like it was going to explode. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail where the other team was coming to meet us. When we finally caught our breath and explained what we'd seen, the lead deputy looked at us like we were insane. I could see the skepticism in his eyes, but Dale backed me up. Corey, too. 3 witnesses. They had to take it seriously. They sent a tactical team back to the clearing with us. 6 officers, all armed, all wearing body armor. By the time we returned, it was almost dark. The bodies were still there. All 6 trees had remains inside them. They started documenting everything, taking photos, measurements. But the thing we'd seen was gone. They found tracks leading away from the clearing, large snowshoe prints. But these were normal stride length, maybe 3 feet apart. The 7-foot strides from earlier were nowhere to be found in that immediate area. It was like the tracks had changed. They found Greg about an hour later. He was alive but barely responsive, stuffed into the last tree well bound with wire. He was hypothermic and catatonic. They got him out, got him warm, airlifted him to the hospital. When he finally came around 2 days later in the hospital, he told the police he'd been chased by something white. He said it moved on all 4s on top of the snow crust without breaking through. He said it had whistled at him, the same 3-note pattern over and over. He said it stood up when it caught him, stood up on 2 legs and grabbed him with hands that felt like ice. The doctors wrote it off as hypothermia-induced hallucination. They said his brain was oxygen deprived, that he'd imagined the whole encounter. 3 weeks later, they arrested a man named Silas Holland. He was a survivalist, a hermit who'd been living in a camp about 2 miles from the clearing. They found evidence in his camp: tools, wire mesh, old photographs of the victims. Case closed. The official report said Holland was responsible for the deaths of 6 people over the span of 8 years. He was a large man, 6'4", strong build. The DA argued he'd used stilts or some kind of apparatus to make those long stride tracks to throw off investigators. Holland never spoke during his trial. He never confirmed or denied anything. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea, but Holland himself just sat there silent. But here's what bothers me. I saw the evidence photos. I saw Holland's snowshoes. They were normal size. Modern ones too, not the vintage wooden type that made those tracks. And the dental molds from the bite marks on the bodies, they submitted those to forensic analysis. The report said they didn't match Holland. They didn't match a bear either. The official explanation was that animals had gotten to the remains after death and the marks were too degraded to be conclusive. But I read that report. The marks were consistent across all 6 bodies. Same bite radius, same tooth spacing. Whatever made those marks, it wasn't random scavenging. I was there. I saw what was standing across that clearing. That thing was not 6'4". It was not wearing stilts. And I've never heard of any human being who could move through deep snow that quickly without making a sound. The locals have stories about that area. Old stories that predate the ski resorts and vacation cabins. They don't call it a feral human. They call it something else. They use a word I won't repeat here. When I asked about it at a bar in town after the trial, an old man told me the woods have always taken people. He said some come back, some don't, and some come back wrong. Dale quit search and rescue 6 months later. He won't talk about that day. I tried reaching out several times, but he never responds. Corey moved out of state, packed up and left within a year. Greg recovered physically, but his wife said he never went hiking again, never even went outside unless he had to. I still volunteer. I still go into those woods, but I don't go near that clearing anymore. And when I'm out there and I hear a whistle, I don't answer. I just turn around and leave. Some things are better left alone, and maybe Holland was responsible. Maybe the case really is closed. But I keep thinking about those tracks, about the stride length, about the way that thing moved. And I wonder if they caught the right predator or if something else is still out there, using the trees as a pantry, waiting for the next storm, waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the trail. Atlas died last year, old age. But in his final months, he wouldn't go near the mountains anymore. He'd whine and pull back whenever we got close to the trailhead, like he remembered, like he knew. I've been working as a wildlife biologist for almost 15 years now, and I've seen a lot of strange things out in the field. Elk with deformities, black bears behaving oddly, cougars in places they shouldn't be. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever made me question reality the way those photos did. This happened just after New Year's Day back in 2019. I was stationed at the Olympic National Park Research Facility working on a Roosevelt elk migration study. My job was pretty straightforward. Deploy motion-activated cameras throughout the Hoh rainforest, collect the SD cards every few weeks, and catalog thousands of images to track movement patterns. It's tedious work, if I'm being honest. Most of the photos are just trees swaying in the wind or the occasional deer wandering past. You spend hours scrolling through thousands of images, and 99% of them are completely useless. False triggers from branches moving in the wind, raindrops on the lens, that sort of thing. But, every so often you catch something interesting. A cougar on the hunt, a bear marking its territory, maybe a rare Roosevelt elk doing something unusual. Those moments make all the tedious cataloging worth it. The cameras we use are military-grade trail cams with infrared night vision, and they're triggered by any significant motion within about 30 feet. We had about 40 of them scattered across 100 square miles of dense rainforest that winter. The area I was monitoring was particularly remote even by Hoh rainforest standards. The Hoh is one of the wettest places in the continental United States. We're talking something like 12 feet of rain annually. Everything is covered in moss. The trees, the rocks, even the fallen logs look like they're wrapped in thick green carpet. The trees themselves are massive Sitka spruce and western hemlock, so thick you can barely see the sky even on a clear day. It's beautiful in a primordial sort of way, but it's also incredibly isolating. When you're out there alone, you feel like you've stepped back in time to before humans existed. There's a heaviness to the silence, if that makes sense. The kind of quiet that presses in on you. I was working alone that winter. My usual field partner had taken a job in Alaska, and the Park Service hadn't found a replacement yet. I didn't mind too much. I've always been comfortable in the woods. I grew up in Washington State, spent most of my childhood hiking and camping with my dad. The forest has never scared me, or at least it didn't used to. On January 3rd, I got a call from the ranger station. It was early, maybe 7 a.m., and I was still at my apartment drinking coffee and dreading the drive out to the field office. The ranger on duty, a guy named Gus Pemberton, who I'd worked with a few times, told me they had a situation. A solo hiker named Maya Parsons had been reported missing. She'd gone out for a day hike on January 2nd and never came back to her car. Her family had filed a report that morning when she didn't show up for breakfast. Search and rescue was being mobilized, but they wanted to know if any of my cameras might have caught her on the trail. The timing was right. She'd entered the forest around midday on the 2nd, which meant if she'd stuck to the main trail, she would have passed at least a few of my cameras. I told Gus I'd check immediately and that I'd call him back within the hour. I grabbed my gear and drove out to the field office, which was about 40 minutes from my apartment. The whole drive, I kept thinking about how I hoped the cameras had caught something useful. Missing person cases in the park were rare, but when they happened, they were usually bad. The forest is unforgiving, especially in winter. Hypothermia can set in within hours if you're wet and lost, and the Hoh River can be deadly if you slip and fall in. I got to the office and immediately started pulling SD cards from the cameras closest to the trailhead where Maya's car had been found. Camera number 4 was positioned about 3 miles in along the Hoh River Trail, right where the path splits toward the high bridge. It was one of my most reliable units. It rarely gave false triggers, and the battery life was solid. I loaded the card into my laptop and started scrolling through the images. Most of them were from the previous week, just the usual wildlife activity. A few deer, a raccoon, rummaging through the undergrowth, one blurry shot of what might have been a bobcat. Then I saw her. The timestamp read January 2nd, 4:13 p.m. Maya Parsons hiking northbound on the trail heading deeper into the forest. She was smiling, or at least she looked relaxed. Her expression was calm, maybe a little tired, but nothing that suggested distress. She was wearing a bright yellow rain shell, one of those high-visibility jackets that practically glows in low light. She also had a blue backpack with white straps, and I could see a water bottle clipped to the side. The image was clear enough that I could see the brand logo on the pack, some outdoor company I didn't recognize. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had on dark hiking pants and boots. She looked prepared, like someone who knew what they were doing. I saved the photo and noted the timestamp. Then I kept scrolling. 15 minutes later at 4:28 p.m., the camera triggered again. At first, I thought it was Maya doubling back. Maybe she'd realized she was running out of daylight and decided to turn around. The figure was wearing the same bright yellow jacket and blue backpack. But something felt off immediately. I zoomed in. The person was taller than Maya, noticeably taller. I'd estimate Maya was maybe 5'4" or 5'5" based on the first photo. This figure looked closer to 6 feet, maybe even taller. The jacket sleeves were too short. I could see several inches of bare wrist exposed, even though it was January and freezing. The backpack looked strained, like it was being worn by someone it didn't fit. The straps were pulled tight to the point where they looked like they might snap. And the posture was wrong. Maya had been walking upright, relaxed stride, casual body language. This figure was hunched forward, shoulders rolled in, like it was carrying something heavy or trying to stay low to the ground. The way it moved, even in a still image you could sense the movement, was awkward, almost animalistic. I stared at the image for a long time, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was, maybe she'd met up with someone on the trail and they'd swapped gear. But why would anyone do that? And why would they be heading in the same direction she'd just gone? It didn't make sense. I made a note of the timestamp and kept scrolling, but there were no more images from camera 4 that day. I pulled the card from camera number 5. This one was positioned 2 miles further up the trail, near a creek crossing, where the path narrowed and got rocky. If Maya had kept going north, she would have passed through this camera's range. I loaded the card and scrolled to January 2nd. At 4:52 p.m., Maya passed through. This time she wasn't smiling. Her face was turned slightly to the side, like she was looking over her shoulder. Her body language screamed tension. I could see it even in a still image. The way her shoulders were raised, the way her stride looked hurried, almost like she was jogging. Her expression was hard to read because of the angle, but I could make out enough to know she looked scared. Something had spooked her. Then at 4:57 p.m., the second figure appeared. This is the part I still have trouble explaining. The camera captured it mid-motion, and the image was slightly blurred from the movement, but I could make out enough to know this wasn't right. It wasn't walking. It was moving on all fours. The yellow jacket was still visible, and so was the blue backpack. But the figure was low to the ground, running, if you can even call it that, in a loping, uneven gait. The arms were too long. That's what I noticed first. Even hunched over, even with the motion blur, the limbs looked disproportionate. The hands, if they were hands, were touching the ground as it moved. It looked like something pretending to be human, but not quite getting it right. My stomach dropped. I sat back in my chair and just stared at the screen for I don't know how long. My hands were shaking, and I felt this cold, creeping sensation up my spine. I didn't want to keep going, but I had to. I had to know what happened. I pulled the card from camera number 6. This one was positioned at a river ford about a mile past camera 5. It was a spot where the trail crossed a shallow section of the Ho River. In summer, it's an easy crossing, maybe knee-deep at most. But in winter, with all the rain and snow melt, it gets deeper and the current gets stronger. People have died there. The first image from January 2nd was time-stamped 11:43 p.m. It was pitch black. The only illumination came from the camera's infrared flash. Maya was standing in the water. She was facing the camera, her mouth open, in what I can only describe as a scream. Her hands were raised in front of her palms, out like she was trying to push something away or shield herself. The water was up to her knees, and I could see the current pulling at her legs. Her face was a mask of pure terror. I've never seen an expression like that captured on film before. It looked primal, like someone staring death in the face. Then there was another image. 11:59 p.m. 11:59. 1 minute before midnight. The figure in the yellow jacket was behind her, emerging from the ferns on the far bank. The hood of the jacket was up. I zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow, and my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the laptop. Inside the hood there was no face. I don't mean it was obscured or shadowed by the hood. I mean there was nothing. Just smooth wet skin, or maybe bark or moss. I honestly couldn't tell. It looked organic, but wrong. The texture was all wrong. It looked slick and dark, and the proportions of the head underneath were too large, too round. The image quality wasn't good enough to make out fine details, but I could see enough to know that whatever was wearing that jacket wasn't human. I closed the laptop. I literally slammed it shut. I didn't want to look anymore. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe it was a person in a costume. Maybe it was a hoax. Maybe the images were corrupted somehow and I was seeing things that weren't there. But deep down I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. I picked up my phone and called Gus at the ranger station. I told him I had images of Maya on the trail and that they needed to see them immediately. He asked if she looked okay in the photos, and I hesitated. I didn't mention the second figure. I don't know why. I think part of me was still trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I told him she looked distressed in the later photos and that she'd made it as far as the river crossing. Search and rescue found Maya's body the next day. She was discovered about half a mile downstream from the river crossing, tangled up in some downed trees along the bank. The official cause of death was hypothermia, complicated by drowning. She'd fallen into the water, gotten disoriented in the dark, and succumbed to the cold. It was a tragic accident. That's what everyone said. The search coordinator told me she probably slipped on the rocks, lost her footing, and was swept downstream. In water that cold, your muscles seize up within minutes. You can't swim. You can't even move properly. It's a horrible way to die. But they never found her yellow jacket. They never found her blue backpack either. When I mentioned it to one of the SAR coordinators, a woman named Fiona Wheaton, who I'd met a few times at park events, she just shrugged and said the current probably carried them away. Gear gets lost in the river all the time, she told me. Sometimes it washes up miles downstream. Sometimes it gets snagged on debris and sinks. Sometimes it just disappears. I wanted to believe that. I really did. I wanted to believe this was just a tragic accident and that the images I'd seen were some kind of technical glitch or misunderstanding. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something real, something that didn't belong in any wildlife biology textbook. About 2 weeks later, I was back in the field collecting data from a different set of cameras. These were positioned about 50 miles south near the Quinault River, in a completely different section of the park. I wasn't even thinking about Maya anymore, or at least I was trying not to. I'd filed my report with the Park Service, handed over copies of all the images, and tried to convince myself it was over. Just focus on the elk study, I kept telling myself. Don't think about the photos. Don't think about what you saw. I loaded one of the SD cards and started scrolling through the images. Most of them were nothing, just rain and shadows and the occasional deer. Then I saw it. The timestamp read January 15th, 2:34 a.m. A figure standing at the edge of a campground, bright yellow rain shell, blue backpack with white straps, the same jacket, the same pack. My heart stopped. The figure was standing completely still about 20 feet from a tent. It was one of those big family tents with the rain fly and the mesh windows. Inside the tent, I could make out the faint glow of a lantern and the silhouettes of two people. A couple maybe, or a parent and child. They were sitting up talking or reading. They had no idea something was watching them. The figure wasn't moving, it was just standing there perfectly still, like it was studying them. I zoomed in on the face. The hood was down this time. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't smooth anymore. There was a face, or something that looked like a face. It was pale, almost white, and the features were almost right. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. But the proportions were off. The eyes were too far apart, set too wide on the skull. The mouth was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear. It looked like someone had tried to sculpt a human face from memory, but gotten the details wrong. Like it had studied human features, but couldn't quite replicate them correctly. The expression was blank. There was no emotion, just empty staring. It was the uncanny valley taken to an extreme. I saved the image and immediately checked the rest of the card. There were 3 more photos from that night, all taken within a 10-minute span. In each one, the figure had moved closer to the tent. 2:37 a.m. it was 15 feet away. 2:39 a.m. it was 10 feet away. In the final image taken at 2:41 a.m. it was crouched directly outside the tent flap. One arm was extended, reaching toward the zipper. The hand, if you could call it that, had too many fingers. I counted 6, maybe 7. They were long and thin, almost like branches. I felt sick looking at it. I reported it immediately. I sent the images to the Park Service and to the local sheriff's department, along with a detailed report explaining what I'd seen. They took it seriously enough to send someone out to interview the campers. Turned out it was a father and his teenage daughter from Seattle. They confirmed they'd heard something outside their tent that night. They said it sounded like scratching at first, then footsteps circling the tent, slowly, methodically. The father said it sounded like someone was walking around them over and over again. They'd been too scared to look outside. The daughter said she'd wanted to scream, but her dad told her to stay quiet. They'd just sat there in the dark, listening. By the time they worked up the courage to unzip the tent and shine a light, whatever it was had gone. The Park Service launched an investigation, but nothing came of it. They sent rangers out to search the area, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no evidence, no sign of anyone or anything unusual. They suggested it was a bear or maybe a person trying to steal food. Just some weirdo in a costume and trying to scare campers, they said. But I've worked with bears my entire career. I know what they look like on trail cams. I know how they move, how they behave. That wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person either. I pulled my cameras after that, all of them. I told my supervisor I needed to reposition them for better elk coverage, but that was a lie. I just didn't want to see any more photos. I didn't want to know what else might be out there. The Park Service reassigned me to data analysis work back at the main office. I still work for them, but I don't do solo field work anymore. I make sure I'm always with a partner, and I avoid the deep forest whenever possible. I know how that sounds. I know people will say I'm being paranoid or that I'm reading too much into grainy photos. Maybe they're right. Maybe I saw exactly what I wanted to see. Maybe my brain filled in the gaps and turned something mundane into something terrifying. But I keep coming back to one question. If it was just a person, why would they take her jacket and backpack? And why would they keep wearing them weeks later, 50 miles away? What kind of person does that? And that face, that wrong, horrible face in the photos from the campground, how do you explain that? I don't have an answer. I don't think I want one. All I know is that there's something in the Hoh rainforest that's learned how to look like us. It's learned how to blend in. It's learned that humans respond to familiar things, to bright colors and backpacks and the appearance of another hiker. And it's still out there watching, waiting for the next person to wander too far off the trail. I think about Maya sometimes. I wonder what her last moments were like. I wonder if she knew what was following her. I wonder if she tried to fight it or if the cold just took her before she had the chance. I hope it was quick. I hope she didn't suffer. But based on that image of her in the water, based on the look on her face, I don't think she got that mercy. I don't go into the Hoh rainforest anymore. I don't think I ever will again. I still think about that raid sometimes. Not the routine ones, we did dozens of those a year, but the one up in the Idaho Panhandle in early January of 2019. I'd been with the FBI's evidence response team for about 6 years by that point, and I thought I'd seen everything: drug labs, illegal weapons caches, survivalist compounds, stocked with enough ammunition to fight a small war, but what we found in that shed still keeps me up at night. It started as a standard domestic terrorism case. Our field office in Spokane had been monitoring a guy named Elias Thorne for about 8 months. He wasn't on any watch lists, but he'd been flagged by a supplier who reported that he was buying industrial quantities of windshield washer fluid. I'm talking 500 gallons every few months. The supplier thought he was cooking meth or making some kind of explosive, so they tipped us off. When we started digging, we found out Thorne lived alone on 40 acres of heavily wooded property near the Canadian border. He had no job, no visible income, and kept ordering generators and chest freezers. Lots of them. The profile fit a certain type. Radical prepper, possible militia ties, definitely paranoid. The area around there has history. Ruby Ridge happened less than an hour away, so we didn't take any chances. The plan was to execute a warrant on January 3rd, right after the New Year holiday. We figured if he was building something dangerous, we needed to move before he could use it. I remember the morning of the raid pretty clearly. It was brutally cold, maybe 10 below zero, and the snow was piled so high along the Forest Service roads that our vehicles could barely get through. There were 12 of us, 4 SWAT, 2 case agents, 3 forensic techs, and me, along with 2 other evidence guys. We staged about half a mile from the property and hiked in on foot. The woods were dead silent except for the crunch of our boots in the snow. Nobody spoke. That kind of cold makes even breathing painful. When we got close enough to see the compound, I felt my stomach tighten. The main house was small, more of a cabin really, with smoke coming from a metal chimney. But behind it was a large shed, maybe 30 by 40 feet. and even from a distance I could hear it. This deep, mechanical hum. It sounded like multiple generators all running at once. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with someone making bombs. You don't need that much continuous power for explosives. The SWAT team breached the cabin first. I was posted outside with the rest of the response team waiting for the all clear. It came faster than I expected. Thorne didn't resist. He didn't even argue. He walked out with his hands up wearing this ratty old bathrobe and unlaced boots. He looked older than I thought he'd be. Probably mid-60s with a long gray beard and these pale, watery eyes. But what I remember most was how calm he seemed. He wasn't angry or scared. He was just staring past us, toward the shed. As they cuffed him, he kept asking the same question over and over. "Did you keep the power on? You have to keep the power on." One of the case agents told him everything was fine, but Thorne just shook his head. "You don't understand," he said. "If they warm up, they'll die." That's when it hit me that something was seriously wrong. The agent asked him what he meant by they, but Thorne wouldn't answer. They put him in one of the vehicles and told us to clear the shed. I was assigned to go in first with one of the forensic techs, a guy named Ruiz. We approached the door and I could feel the cold radiating through the walls. The hum of the generators was deafening up close. Ruiz glanced at me and I nodded. He pushed the door open. The temperature inside that shed was unreal. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I could feel the moisture in my nose freezing instantly. The space was filled with generators, 6 of them, all industrial grade, all running full blast. But that wasn't what made me stop. In the center of the room were 4 massive chest freezers, the kind you'd see in a grocery store. They were all locked with heavy padlocks, and they were all connected to a central pump by clear plastic tubing. The fluid inside the tubes was bright blue. I'd seen enough antifreeze in my life to recognize it immediately. Ruiz walked over to one of the freezers and tested the lock. It was solid. He called back to the team and asked if anyone had bolt cutters. While we waited, I walked around the room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The pump was connected to all 4 freezers, and the blue liquid was circulating through the system. On the far wall was a digital timer. It was counting down, but I couldn't tell to what. The numbers read 72 hours and 18 minutes. One of the other guys brought in the cutters and Ruiz positioned them on the first padlock. I remember feeling this wave of dread wash over me right before he squeezed. I didn't know what we were about to find, but every instinct I had was screaming that I didn't want to see it. The lock popped and Ruiz lifted the lid. I literally took a step back. Inside the freezer was a woman. She was lying on her back, dressed in a silver sequin dress, the kind you'd wear to a New Year's Eve party. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint blue tint. She looked perfect. No frost, no decay, no sign of decomposition. But the worst part was the tubing. 2 IV lines ran into her neck, connecting her to the pump. The blue antifreeze was running through her veins. Ruiz said something, I don't even remember what, but I couldn't respond. I just stood there staring. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing, but it didn't make any sense. This wasn't a body, this was something else, something preserved. One of the case agents came in and saw what we'd found. He immediately called for backup and told us to open the other freezers. I moved to the second one and cut the lock. Inside was a man in his 30s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Same blue tint, same tubing, same perfect preservation. The third freezer held another woman, older, in a heavy winter coat. The fourth had a younger guy in a college hoodie. 4 bodies, all hooked up to the pump, all filled with antifreeze instead of blood. That's when I heard Thorne screaming from outside. He was still in the patrol vehicle, but he'd somehow seen us open the freezers. He was yelling at the top of his lungs, "Don't disconnect them. They aren't ready. You'll kill them." The officers tried to calm him down, but he kept screaming. "The cycle isn't complete. They have to cross the threshold." I stepped outside to get some air. My hands were shaking and I felt like I might throw up. Ruiz followed me out and we just stood there for a minute, not saying anything. Behind us, I could hear the generators still humming. One of them started to sputter. The sound was subtle at first, but then it got louder. I turned around just as the power dipped. The lights inside the shed flickered. That's when we heard it. A sound from inside one of the freezers. A wet, crackling noise like ice breaking. Ruiz and I ran back in. The second freezer, the one with the man in the flannel shirt, was open. One of the other techs had been examining it. The man inside was moving. Not alive, not breathing, but moving. His arm jerked, his fingers twitched, and then his eyes opened. They were solid blue, frozen. The electrical current from the faulty generator was stimulating his muscles. He sat up and his frozen joints shattered with this horrible cracking sound. Then he screamed. No sound came out, but his mouth opened wide and I could see his frozen tongue and his blue teeth. A second later, he collapsed backward into the freezer and his body just broke apart, like he was made of ice. I stumbled out of the shed and fell to my knees in the snow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Ruiz was yelling for a medic, but I waved him off. I wasn't hurt. I was just in shock. They shut down the generators after that and called in a full crime scene unit. The bodies were removed and taken to the state medical examiner's office in Boise. Thorne was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The investigation took months. We identified the victims through dental records and missing persons reports. The woman in the sequin dress had disappeared on New Year's Eve in 2015. The man in the flannel went missing in 2017. The others were from 2016 and 2018. All of them had been reported missing within a few days of New Year's. All of them had last been seen alone, drunk at a bar, walking home from a party, sitting in a parking lot. Thorne had picked them up, convinced them he was helping, and then brought them back to his compound. We found his manifesto in the cabin. It was hundreds of pages long, handwritten, completely delusional. He believed the world ended every year at 11:59 p.m. and was reborn at midnight. He thought that if he could preserve people through the transition, they'd come back when the new world started. He called it crossing the threshold. The antifreeze was supposed to keep them from dying. In his mind, he wasn't killing them. He was saving them. The autopsy reports confirmed what I already suspected. They didn't die from the cold. They died from the antifreeze, ethylene glycol poisoning. But because of the chemical preservation, their bodies couldn't decompose. They were perfectly frozen, suspended. Thorne never went to trial. He died in county jail 3 weeks after his arrest. Heart attack. Part of me was relieved. I didn't want to sit in a courtroom and relive what I'd seen in that shed. The bodies were eventually released to their families and buried in their hometowns. I didn't go to any of the funerals. I couldn't. But about 2 years later, I was driving through northern Idaho on another case, and I decided to stop by the cemetery where one of the victims had been buried. The woman in the sequin dress Her name was Annie. I don't know why I went. Maybe I just needed to see that it was over. That she was finally at peace. I found her grave easily enough. It was in the back corner of the cemetery under a pine tree. But when I walked up to it, I noticed something strange. The grass around the headstone was dead. Not brown, dead. And the ground beneath it looked frozen even though it was the middle of summer. I knelt down and touched the soil. It was ice cold. I asked the groundskeeper about it later. He said they'd tried replanting the grass 3 times, but nothing would grow. The chemicals were still there, still leaking into the earth, keeping it frozen. He said they'd probably have to dig up the whole plot and replace the soil. Maybe they did. I never went back to check. I still think about Thorne sometimes, about what he believed, about how he could convince himself that what he was doing was right. 4 people dead because one man thought he could stop time. And the worst part? I don't think he ever understood that they were gone. In his mind, they were just waiting. Still waiting to wake up when the new world finally came. I transferred out of the evidence response team about a year after the raid. I told my supervisors it was for personal reasons and they didn't push. I work in cybercrime now. It's safer, cleaner. I don't have to see the bodies anymore. But every New Year's Eve, when the clock is about to strike midnight, I think about that shed, about the hum of the generators, about the blue liquid in those tubes. And I wonder if somewhere out there someone else is trying to cross the threshold. I've been a detective for 16 years, and I've seen plenty of accidents on hiking trails. People slip, lose their footing, misjudge a ledge. But this case still keeps me up at night, and I genuinely don't think I'll ever make sense of what happened. This was back in early January of 2019. I work out of a small precinct in Stevenson, Washington, just across from the Columbia River Gorge. We handle everything from petty theft to the occasional bar fight, but deaths on the trails, those come with the territory too. Most of them are straightforward. An older hiker has a heart attack. Someone underestimates the ice and goes down hard. You document it, notify the family, file the report, and move on. This one was different from the start. The call came in on New Year's Day around 9 a.m. A group of hikers had found a body at the base of High Rock Lookout. If you're not familiar, High Rock is this massive cliff that juts out about 600 feet above the valley floor. It's a popular spot during the warmer months, but in winter most people stay away. The ice makes the trails dangerous, and the winds up there can knock you off balance if you're not careful. The dispatcher told me it looked like a fall and that the victim was a young male in his early 20s. She also mentioned that there were 4 witnesses, friends of the victim who'd been with him when it happened. I grabbed my partner, Andy Kohler, and we drove out to the trailhead. The roads were still covered in patchy snow from the night before, and the temperature was hovering just above freezing. When we arrived, there was already a small crowd gathered near the parking area. A couple of EMTs were standing by their rig, and a park ranger was talking to a group of 4 young people huddled together near a blue SUV. They looked cold but not particularly distressed, if that makes sense. No tears, no visible shaking, just this kind of blank staring into the distance. That struck me as odd right away. Andy and I hiked down to where the body was. It took us about 20 minutes to get there, and the whole time I kept thinking about how remote this spot was. You don't just stumble onto High Rock Lookout. You have to know it's there, and you have to want to go there. The victim was lying face down in the snow, about 30 yards from the base of the cliff. His name was Caleb Driscoll, 22 years old, a recent graduate from Portland State. He was wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and a down vest. One of his hiking boots was missing. I made a note of that immediately. The other boot was still on his left foot, laces tied tight. The fall had done exactly what you'd expect. Multiple fractures, severe head trauma, internal bleeding. The coroner would confirm it later, but it was clear he died on impact. What wasn't clear was how he'd ended up so far from the cliff face. I'm not a physicist, but I've worked enough of these cases to know that when someone slips and falls, they tend to drop almost straight down. Maybe they tumble a bit, maybe they hit an outcropping on the way, but they don't launch outward. Caleb's body was positioned in a way that suggested he'd gone over with serious forward momentum. That didn't fit the narrative I was already starting to hear from the witnesses. We hiked back up to the top, and I found the spot where it happened. There was a wooden railing along the edge of the lookout, and one section of it was broken, the wood splintered outward. On top of the intact section of railing, sitting perfectly upright, was Caleb's missing boot. It was placed there deliberately. If he'd slipped or stumbled, the boot would have fallen with him or been kicked off in the struggle. This was something else. I crouched down and examined the area. There were footprints everywhere in the snow, at least 5 different sets of treads all overlapping. I took photos of everything. Andy and I walked back to the group. The 4 of them were still standing by the SUV. There was a girl named Bryn Kessler, short brown hair, athletic build, wearing a Gore-Tex jacket that looked expensive. Next to her was Garrett Finley, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard, and this way of standing that screamed former high school football player. Then there was Juliet Landry, quieter than the other 2, pale face, kept her hands jammed in her coat pockets. And finally there was Miles Humphrey, the one who seemed to be doing most of the talking. He had this rehearsed quality to his voice, like he'd already run through the story a few times in his head before we even got there. Miles explained that they'd all driven up the night before to camp near the lookout and watch the sunrise on New Year's Day. They said it was a tradition they'd started back in college. They'd been friends for years, all of them into rock climbing and backcountry hiking. Caleb had been part of the group since freshman year. According to Miles, they'd been drinking the night before, nothing crazy, just a few beers and a flask of whiskey they'd passed around. Caleb had gotten pretty drunk, and when they hiked up to the lookout in the early morning, he was still a little unsteady on his feet. Miles said Caleb had joked about doing a handstand on the railing. They told him not to, but he'd laughed it off and climbed up anyway. That's when he lost his balance and went over. I asked them to walk me through it, step by step. Bryn took over the story at that point. She said Caleb had grabbed the railing and pulled himself up. He'd gotten one hand planted and was about to kick his legs up when his boot slipped on the icy wood. He tipped forward, and before anyone could grab him, he was gone. She said it happened so fast none of them had time to react. I asked if anyone had tried to pull him back. Garrett shook his head. He said they'd all lunged for him, but by the time they reached the railing, he was already falling. Juliet didn't say much during the interview. She just nodded along with the others. Something about their story felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it yet. Andy and I thanked them and said we'd be in touch. We told them not to leave town, which seemed to make Miles uncomfortable. He asked if they were in trouble. I said no, just standard procedure for any incident like this. They all nodded and climbed into the SUV. I watched them drive away. None of them looked back. Back at the station, I started pulling everything together. The coroner's report came in 2 days later, and that's when things started to unravel. The doc noted multiple bruises on Caleb's body, wrists, forearms, ankles. He flagged them as unusual because they didn't match the pattern of impact injuries. These were pressure bruises, the kind you get when someone grabs you hard and holds on. I asked him to photograph them, and when I saw the images, my stomach dropped. The bruises on his ankles were handprints. You could see the individual fingers. And they were positioned in a way that suggested Caleb had been held upside down. I called Andy and told him we needed to go back to the scene. We drove out the next morning and spent 3 hours combing the area. That's when I found the flask. It was half buried in the snow, about 10 feet from where the railing was broken. I bagged it and sent it to the lab. The fingerprint analysis came back a week later. There were 5 sets of prints on the flask, Caleb's and the 4 witnesses. But here's the thing. The prints were overlapping in a way that suggested the flask had been passed around after Caleb's death. The timestamps didn't add up. If they'd all been drinking the night before, the prints would have degraded or been smudged by condensation. These were fresh, crisp, pressed into the metal like they'd been left there deliberately. Then there was the disposable camera. One of the rangers had found it near the parking area and turned it in. I had the film developed. There were about 24 photos, group shots, scenic, views, a few candid images of them setting up camp. The last photo was the one that broke the case wide open. It was taken at the lookout right before dawn. All 5 of them were standing near the railing. Caleb was in the middle. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his mouth was open like he was about to say something. The other 4 were on either side of him. They were smiling, but their eyes were dead, empty. And here's the kicker. Garrett and Miles were holding Caleb's arms. Bryn and Juliet were crouched down near his legs. I brought them all in for questioning. I separated them. Started with Juliet because she'd been the quietest during the initial interview. I figured she'd be the weak link. I showed her the photo. I told her we knew what happened. I told her the bruises on Caleb's ankles matched the grip pattern of human hands. I told her the flask had been passed around after he died. She stared at the photo for a long time. Then she looked up at me, and I swear to God, she didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just whispered, "We wanted to know if we could trust each other." I asked her what that meant. She said it had started as a joke. They'd been talking about loyalty and trust and what it meant to really know someone. Caleb had been the one who brought it up. He'd said that true friendship meant being willing to do anything for each other, even the unthinkable. Someone, Juliet couldn't remember who, had suggested they prove it. They'd drawn straws. Caleb had drawn the short one. At first, they'd all laughed it off, but then Miles had said, "What if we actually did it? What if we just let go?" They'd held him by his ankles, all 4 of them. They dangled him over the edge. Juliet said he'd been laughing at first, trusting them completely, thinking it was just a prank. Then Miles had counted to 3. And on 3, they'd all open their hands. Just like that, no hesitation, no second guessing. They'd all agreed. She said it was supposed to be about trust, but what it really was, what it became, was this sick test to see who would let go first, except they all let go at the same time. I couldn't even process what I was hearing. I asked her why. Why would anyone do that? She didn't have an answer. She just said, "We wanted to know if we could." That was it. That was the only explanation she could give. The DA wouldn't prosecute, said there wasn't enough evidence to prove intent. Called it a prank gone wrong, horseplay, reckless endangerment at worst. The case was closed. The four of them walked out of the station together, and I watched them from the window. They moved in perfect sync, didn't look at each other, didn't speak. They just got in the SUV and drove away. I knew right then that they'd never speak about it again. They were bound for life by what they'd done. A year later, I got a call from a colleague in Oregon. There'd been a hiking accident near Crater Lake. A young woman had slipped and fallen off a ridge. Her name was Juliet Landry. She'd been with 3 friends at the time: Bryn Kessler, Garrett Finley, and Miles Humphrey. They said she'd gotten too close to the edge. Said it happened so fast they couldn't grab her. I didn't need to see the photos to know what I'd find. I already knew. I still think about Caleb sometimes. I think about that moment on the cliff when he realized his friends weren't holding on anymore. I think about the terror he must have felt in those last few seconds. And I think about the 4 of them standing there watching him fall, bound together by a decision they could never undo. That's the thing about trust. Once you break it, once you cross that line, there's no going back. And sometimes the only way to keep a secret that dark is to make sure everyone who knows it stays silent, one way or another. We call them Sims, simulated victims, mannequins, pigs, donated cadavers. After 3 months at the academy, you get desensitized. You stop seeing a person, you see a puzzle, a case file waiting to be solved, and that's exactly what he counted on. My name is Agent Kevin Smith, and this happened during my final month at the FBI Academy back in January of 2023. I was part of the behavioral analysis track, which meant I spent a lot of time studying crime scenes, both real and simulated. The Academy has this massive restricted training facility about 2 hours north of Quantico, tucked away in the dense forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. We called it the Woods. It's where they send you for wilderness forensics training, search and recovery, body decomposition analysis, crime scene reconstruction in remote areas, the kind of stuff you don't learn in a classroom. I'd been looking forward to this rotation for months. Most of my classmates dreaded it, the cold, the hiking, the smell of decomp. But I grew up in rural Montana hunting and camping with my dad, so the outdoors didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like home. Our instructor for the week was a guy named Dr. Malcolm Rauch. He'd been with the Bureau for almost 30 years and had consulted on some of the most notorious serial killer cases in U.S. history. The guy was a legend. He had this weathered face and steel gray hair, and when he spoke, everyone listened. The scenario for our final exam was called the Interstate Killer. We were told that a fictitious serial offender had been dumping bodies along remote Forest Service roads throughout the Pacific Northwest. Our task was to locate and analyze 3 simulated burial sites, profile the offender, and present our findings. Dr. Rauch made it clear that this wasn't just about finding the graves. It was about understanding the psychology behind the placement. Why here? Why this depth? What does the arrangement tell us about the killer's state of mind? We were divided into teams of 4. My team included 2 other agents named Krista Spencer and Ian Lindstrom, and a guy from the cyber division named Jim Moss, who honestly seemed terrified of being outdoors. It was early January and the weather was brutal. There'd been snow on the ground for weeks, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. We packed our gear, shovels, evidence markers, cameras, tarps, and headed into the woods just after sunrise. Dr. Rauch led us about 2 miles down a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the crunch of our boots on frozen ground. When we reached the first site, Dr. Rauch stopped and gestured to a small clearing. He told us that victim 1 was buried somewhere within a 20-foot radius and that we had 2 hours to locate and document the remains. Then he stepped back, crossed his arms, and watched. We got to work. Krista took the lead, using a metal probe to test the soil for anomalies, while Ian and I marked off a grid with stakes and string. Jim mostly just stood there shivering. After about 40 minutes, Krista hit something solid. We all dropped to our knees and started carefully excavating with trowels and brushes. Within minutes, we uncovered bones. A full skeleton arranged in a fetal position about 3 feet down. The skull was intact, and the long bones were still articulated. Dr. Rauch nodded approvingly. He told us it was a medical skeleton used for anatomical studies and that the positioning suggested remorse or a desire to comfort the victim. We documented everything, took measurements, snapped photos, and then moved on to Site 2. This one was deeper in the woods, almost another mile down the trail. The terrain was rougher here, lots of fallen logs and thick underbrush. Dr. Rauch pointed to another clearing and gave us the same instructions. This time Ian found the grave. It was shallower than the first, maybe 18 inches down. When we started digging, I immediately noticed something was off. The bones looked different. They weren't bleached white like the first skeleton. They had this yellowish-brown color, and there were bits of dried tissue still clinging to the ribs. I figured it was just better preservation due to the soil conditions. But then I saw the animals. There were coyote tracks everywhere circling the grave. And when we fully exposed the skeleton, I realized the left femur had been gnawed on. The tooth marks were fresh. I called Dr. Rauch over. I told him the coyotes had been scavenging the remains, and he laughed. He said that they use ethically sourced cadaver bones for realism, and that scavenger activity was actually a good teaching moment. He explained how animals can scatter remains and complicate a recovery. It made sense. I nodded and went back to work. But then I saw it. The watch. It was on the left wrist, partially buried in the dirt. A fitness tracker. A Fitbit, to be specific. The kind with the little LED screen and the silicone band. I reached down and brushed the soil away. The screen was cracked, but I could still make out the brand logo. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Medical cadavers don't wear watches, especially not Fitbits, especially not new ones. I looked up at Krista. I asked her if she saw what I was seeing, and she crouched down beside me. Her face went pale. She whispered that that wasn't supposed to be there. Dr. Rauch was standing about 10 feet away, talking to Ian and Jim. I stood up and walked over. I tried to keep my voice steady. I told him that there was a problem with Site 2, and he raised an eyebrow. He asked me what kind of problem, and I told him that the skeleton was wearing a Fitbit, a modern one. He frowned. He said that that was impossible, and walked over to the grave. He stared down at the bones for a moment, and I watched his expression change. The confidence drained from his face. He told us not to touch anything else, and pulled out his phone. While he made the call, I crouched back down and looked at the skeleton more closely. The bones weren't just discolored. They were wrong. The sutures in the skull hadn't fully fused, which meant this person had been young, maybe mid-20s. And there was something else. A small round hole in the back of the skull. It was too clean to be from an animal. It looked like a bullet entry wound. My stomach dropped. I stood up and looked around the clearing. The positioning of the body suddenly felt different. It wasn't staged for education. It was staged to look like education. The shallow depth, the fetal position, the location near the trail. Someone had buried this person here, knowing we'd find them, knowing we'd assume it was just another prop. Dr. Rauch got off the phone. His face was ashen. He told us that we needed to evacuate the site immediately and that a forensics team was on the way. He said that we weren't to speak to anyone about what we'd found until the investigation was complete. We packed our gear in silence and hiked back to the trailhead. None of us said a word. The next 48 hours were a blur. The forensics team arrived that afternoon and cordoned off the entire training area. They brought in ground-penetrating radar cadaver dogs, the works. I was questioned 3 separate times by investigators from the Bureau's inspection division. They wanted to know everything. What I'd seen, what I'd touched, whether I'd noticed anything unusual before we found the watch. On the 3rd day, they called me into a conference room. There were 2 senior agents waiting for me along with Dr. Rauch, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. They told me that they'd exhumed Site 2 completely and that what we'd found wasn't a training prop. It was the body of a 24-year-old woman named Kelsey Bradford who'd been reported missing from Seattle 8 months earlier. She'd been shot once in the back of the head and buried in the exact location where the academy had planned to place a training skeleton. But it got worse. They'd continued searching the area with the cadaver dogs. They found 6 more bodies, all of them buried within the restricted training zone, all of them positioned in ways that mimicked the academy's standard crime scene simulations. Shallow graves, fetal positions, staged with the kind of precision that suggested someone with forensic knowledge. The bodies ranged in age from 19 to 32, all women, all reported missing from cities across the Pacific Northwest over the past decade. The killer wasn't an instructor. It was a man named Lyle Garber, a civilian contractor who'd been hired to maintain the grounds at the woods for the past 12 years. He cleared trails filled in old excavation sites and prepped new training areas. He had unrestricted access to the facility and he knew the academy's schedule. He knew when and where the instructors would plant their training scenarios. And he'd been using that knowledge to hide real bodies among the fake ones. The investigators showed me security footage of Garber. He was in his late 50s with a lean build and a face that looked hardened by years of outdoor work. He'd been a groundskeeper at a state park in Oregon before coming to work for the academy. Quiet, reliable, no criminal record. The kind of guy who blended in. They told me that Garber had been arrested at his home just outside of Port Angeles. When they searched his property, they found a storage unit filled with personal items from the victims. Jewelry, ID cards, photographs. He'd kept trophies. During his interrogation, he admitted to all 7 murders. He said he chose the woods because he knew no civilians ever went there, only agents. And agents would assume everything was fake. He'd been cleaning up his own crimes right under the Bureau's nose, hiding them in plain sight. letting us walk past them, photograph them, grade them as excellent props. I still think about it a lot, about how close we came to just moving on to Site 3 without a second thought. If I hadn't seen that Fitbit, if I'd just assumed it was part of the realism, Kelsey Bradford might still be out there, along with the others. I think about how many times instructors had probably walked past those graves, how many training exercises had been conducted within feet of real victims. Dr. Rauch retired a month after the investigation concluded. I heard he couldn't handle the guilt, the knowledge that he'd been teaching over a graveyard for years and never knew. I finished my training and got assigned to the behavioral analysis unit like I'd wanted. But I requested to never work out of the woods again. They shut down the facility for 8 months while they swept every inch of forest. They didn't find any more bodies, but that doesn't mean there aren't more out there. Garber never gave a full confession. He only admitted to the 7 we found. When investigators asked him if there were others, he just smiled and said that some puzzles aren't meant to be solved. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if there are more victims buried somewhere in those woods. What I do know is that expert blindness is real. We were so sure we knew everything, so confident in our training, that we missed the reality right in front of us. We saw what we expected to see. And that's the most terrifying part. Not the killer, not the bodies, but the realization that we can be fooled by our own expertise. I still have nightmares about it, about walking through the woods and finding more bones, about digging up graves and finding watches, phones, pieces of identity that prove someone was real. Someone was alive. Someone's daughter or sister or friend. And we almost graded them as excellent props.